It creeps inside a router late at night and hides itself in shadows out of sight. It joins a swarm of millions, vast and free, a silent, sleeping zombie infantry. They wait to hear the master's dark command to flood a target in a distant land. They storm the gates with traffic till they break and leave a ruined server in their wake. It is no single virus on a drive, but as a network swarm, it comes alive. Now guess the name, O admin, if you try. What kind of cyber monster evades the eye? Welcome back to CyberSecureOT, the podcast where we dive deep into the converging worlds of operational technology, network security, and the ever-present threats lurking at the edge of the internet. I'm your host, Dennis. Grab your coffee or your energy drink of choice, because today we're taking a break from the Iran conflict and strapping in for a deep dive into one of the most fascinating and terrifying cyber threats hitting the news right now, botnets. But we aren't just doing the usual corporate rundown. Today, we are putting on our gray hat to examine both the offensive ingenuity and the defensive countermeasures employed by massive decentralized botnets. We need to think like the attacker to build the ultimate defense. Here's a quick breakdown of our show today. We start with a fictionalized scenario to show you what goes on behind the scenes of a botnet cyber event. You'll meet Jakub, a disillusioned former pen tester who builds a hybrid botnet he dubs WhisperNet. We'll explore how he targets the cheap IoT security cameras with hard-coded credentials to amass 150,000 node for his DDoS attacks. That's distributed denial of service. Finally, we'll see how a single 1.4 second OPSEC error with his Tor routing exposes his home IP address, therefore leading to a tactical raid by a nation-state intelligence agency. It's all fictional. Next, we will pivot from fiction to reality, examining the March 19, 2026 joint law enforcement takedown of 4 massive DDoS botnets, the Isaru, Kimwolf, Jackskid, and Mossad. These networks had hijacked over 3 million devices globally and were pushing record-breaking DDoS attacks, peaking at over 30 terabits per second. We will again put on our gray hats to discuss the ethical and operational implications of the United States government remotely wiping the malware from those private devices without getting consent. We also confront the grim reality that while the malware was removed, the underlying device vulnerabilities, well, those were still there and those could still lead to reinfection. Then we're going to move on and analyze the highly evasive KadNap malware. This is a new variant that's recently compromised over 14,000 edge devices, and these are primarily ASUS routers. These are like home routers. We break down how this avoids central command and control servers by utilizing a custom distributed hash table, or DHT, and then it hides in a peer-to-peer traffic within those networks. We'll discuss how these infected nodes are monetized through a proxy service. The proxy service is called Doppelganger, and this allows those cyber criminals to hide who they are and their origins. To fight back, we'll look at the controversial active defense strategies, like using the Sybil attack to poison that DHT routing table and then blind the botnet from the inside out. Finally, we bring the threat directly to the factory floors, discussing how a botnet infection in OT can actually be totally catastrophic. So we'll explore the terrifying new reality of AI-driven botnets, including LLM-coordinated swarms and polymorphic malware that constantly rewrites itself to evade detection. Most importantly, I'm going to ensure that you are equipped with the practical best practices to detect, identify, protect, and stop these threats in your own networks. We'll cover everything from the strict Purdue model network segmentation to aggressively killing default manufacturers' passwords. It's going to be a wild ride. There's a lot of information, so let's get right into it. Right. Now, you know, we like to start these episodes with a fictionalized scenario that highlights each week's topic. These scenarios help you to understand at a high level what goes on behind the scenes of each event discussed. By listening to this scenario and understanding the scenario, you can then also mimic these scenarios in your incident response testing and drills. And that's why I like to do it. But another reason I like to do it is to also help you understand the news that I'm about to share with you. And away we go. Jakub sat in the glow of 3 curved monitors in his subterranean apartment in Prague. A former penetration tester who had grown disillusioned with writing compliance reports, he had decided to build his own distributed computer network, a botnet he dubbed WhisperNet. He knew that traditional centralized botnets were fragile. If a security researcher or law enforcement agency found the central command and control server, they could sinkhole the domain and decapitate the entire network. To avoid this, Jakub conceptually designed a hybrid architecture. Instead of hard-coding a single IP address into his malware payload, he implemented a domain generation algorithm. His code used the current date and a secret seed value to cryptographically generate hundreds of random-looking domains every day. An example was xkqztp2026.net. The infected devices, or bots, would attempt to contact these domains one by one. Jakub only needed to register one of these domains on any given day to establish a connection with his entire fleet. To add another layer of resilience, he structured the core of WhisperNet as a peer-to-peer network. If the bots couldn't reach the DGA domain, they would share instructions among themselves, passing encrypted commands like a digital game of telephone relay. A botnet requires nodes, and Jakub knew that modern desktop operating systems were too well defended. Antivirus software and endpoint detection and response agents would catch his payload in hours, if not less. Instead, he targeted the Internet of Things. He spent weeks mapping the internet using open source scanning tools, searching for a specific brand of cheap, internet-connected security cameras. He had discovered that these devices shipped with a critical vulnerability: broken access control and hard-coded credentials. The concept was simple but devastating. The cameras had a hidden debugging service running on a non-standard port that accepted a factory default username and password, and the users couldn't change those. Jakub wrote a lightweight propagation script, a worm. The worm randomly generated IP addresses and checked if the target port was open. It attempted to log in using those hard-coded credentials. Once inside, it downloaded a small binary compiled specifically for the camera's ARM processor architecture. It loaded itself into the device's volatile memory, because Jakub knew that if the device was rebooted, the malware would be wiped. But the infection rate was so high it didn't matter. He seeded the worm from a rented virtual private server, paid for with tumbleweed cryptocurrency. Within 48 hours, WhisperNet had grown to 150,000 nodes. Jakub's C2 dashboard was a masterpiece of minimalist UI. It displayed a heat map of his infected nodes, glowing clusters in North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Through the dashboard, Jakub could issue high-level commands. He didn't use the network for data theft. The cameras had nothing worth stealing. Instead, he rented out the network's aggregate computing power. His primary method of operation was distributed denial of service, DDoS. Clients on darknet forums would pay him to overwhelm their competitors' web servers. When Jakub initiated the attack, his C2 server would calculate the current day's DGA, register the domain, and post an encrypted instruction file. The 150,000 cameras would check the domain, download the file, decrypt it, and suddenly a target server would be hit with millions of synchronized HTTP GET requests per second. The traffic appeared legitimate, but the sheer volume consumed the target server's resources, rendering the website completely inaccessible. To maintain his anonymity, Jakub accessed his C2 infrastructure exclusively through a complex proxy chain. He routed his connection through the Tor network and then through a service of compromised servers in the non-extradition countries. Jakub's downfall was not a flaw in his code, but a flaw in his hubris. What Jakub didn't know was that a specific subset of the security cameras he had compromised belonged to a defense contractor working on sensitive aerospace technology for a very large nation state. When those cameras suddenly began participating in massive DDoS campaigns, it triggered an anomaly detection alert within a highly classified security operations center. And this was run by a country's premier intelligence agency. The agency's cyber division, an APT or Advanced Persistent Threat Group with virtually unlimited resources, began reverse engineering the WhisperNet binary that they found on their cameras. They quickly cracked Jakub's DGA seed. Instead of shutting the botnet down, they set up a passive monitoring station. They pre-registered future DGA domains and watched the traffic. They were looking for the bot master. Jakub made his fatal OPSEC error on Tuesday at 2 a.m. He had just deployed a major update to his C2 dashboard and wanted to check the node count. In a moment of fatigue, he opened his browser and navigated to his proxy gateway. However, his background script that enforced the Tor routing had silently crashed. For exactly 1.4 seconds, Jakub's home IP address in Prague communicated directly with his proxy gateway, which the intelligence agency had already identified and was actively wiretapping. That single packet of data was all it took. The agency correlated the IP address with the local ISP. They worked through diplomatic channels and international intelligence sharing agreements, matched the IP to Jakub's apartment lease. 3 days later, Jakub was sitting at his monitors, preparing to initiate a new DDoS campaign when his reinforced apartment door exploded inward. Armed tactical units swarmed the room, severing the power to his machines before he could trigger his cryptographic wipe scripts. WhisperNet was dismantled the next day, and Jakub learned the ultimate lesson of the digital age. On the internet, there is always a bigger fish, and perfect anonymity is only a temporary illusion. Now, this has been a fictional story created by CyberSecureOT with the assistance of Google Gemini to illustrate the botnet topic of this episode. All of the names and the locations were made up. This is not representing an actual event or real people. But don't go anywhere. The real story is coming up next. All right, well, I hope you got something out of that story. Now we're going to talk about what we're witnessing over the last week. We've just witnessed one of the most aggressive coordinated law enforcement takedowns of botnet infrastructure in internet history. But this isn't just a story of the good guys catching the bad guys. Today, we're looking at this through a gray hat lens, like I always do. We're going to examine the controversial offensive measures taken by governments, the stark defensive realities we face because of this, and why the lines between legal cyber defense and state-sponsored malware are getting incredibly blurry. Let's set the stage. Just a few days ago, on March 19th, 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice, working alongside authorities in Germany and Canada, dropped a hammer on 4 massive DDoS botnets. We are talking about networks named Isaru, Kimwolf, Jackskid, and Mossad. Between them, these botnets had hijacked over 3 million devices globally. The sheer scale of the firepower here is terrifying. According to the recent piece in Wired titled "U.S. Takes Down Botnets Used in Record-Breaking Cyberattacks," these networks were pushing DDoS attacks peaking at over 30 terabits per second. To put that in perspective, that is nearly 3 times the previous world record. It's enough traffic to knock entire countries offline, let alone an individual corporation or government network completely obliterated. And who were they targeting? Well, according to the Jerusalem Post, in their article on the joint operation, these botnets weren't just taking down gaming servers. They were running massive extortion campaigns and directly targeting the U.S. Department of Defense and their information network. The threat actors were aiming at the very backbone of the military and critical infrastructure and communications. Now, how do you build a 3 million strong bot army? You don't do it by hacking highly secured enterprise servers. You do it by targeting the soft underbelly of the Internet of Things, or IoT. We're talking about Android TV boxes, Soho. These are small office, home office routers, webcams, digital video recorders. The everyday devices sitting in your living room, or worse, sitting on the edge of an industrial network, are poorly configured and never patched. Let's look at how the takedown actually happened, because this is where the gray hat perspective really does kick in and help us. Euronews and DW, Deutsche Welle, both cover the European side of this heavily. The DW report, Germany police dismantle major cyber attack botnets, highlights the massive joint three-nation operation that ripped the command and control servers off the internet. It was a masterpiece of international cooperation. Europol, the FBI, German federal police, and Canadian authorities all working in sync. But taking down the command and control servers is a standard procedure. What the US government did next crossed a very interesting ethical line. According to the Department of Justice, and highlighted in that Wired article, the feds didn't just seize the domains. They remotely wiped the malware from these 3 million private devices. Think about what that means. From a technical standpoint, the United States government deployed its own payload, what some in the InfoSec community are calling like legal malware, to breach private routers and IoT devices without the owner's explicit consent, just to clean up the malware. So let's put on our gray hats for a second and analyze this from an offensive perspective. On one hand, you have the white hat perspective. The internet is a public road. If your car is on fire and driving into oncoming traffic, the fire department has the right to put it out, even if they have to smash your window to do it. By wiping the Isaru and Kimwolf botnets, the government neutralized a 30 terabit weapon of mass disruption. But, and certainly the black hat perspective, sees a dangerous precedent. If the government has the capability, the legal authorization, and the operational audacity to hop into millions of home and business networks to fix a router, what else can they do? Who is watching the watchman? Intrusive code is intrusive code, whether it's written by a teenager in a basement or an agent at the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. Once you establish that state can legally hack its citizens' hardware for the greater good, you open a Pandora's box of privacy and jurisdictional nightmares. And let's not forget the OT implications. What if one of those infected routers was serving as a bridge to an operational technology? Probably not best practice, but let's just talk about it hypothetically. What if the government's wipe command inadvertently bricked a router monitoring a water treatment facility or an HVAC system in a hospital? When you execute code blindly across 3 million heterogeneous devices, you are playing Russian roulette with the system's stability. Isn't it an offensive maneuver that acts as a defensive cure, but the side effects could be fatal? Okay, we've just covered the offensive side of this takedown, the aggressive gray hat nature of the state-sponsored device wiping. Well, let's pivot to actually the defensive side. Because while the press releases from DOJ and German police are taking a victory lap, the reality on the ground is much more grim. For this, I want to reference the fantastic piece by SC World titled US, Canada, and Germany Take Down 4 Large DDoS Botnets. In the article, security experts hit the nail on the head with the crucial phrase, "We must not confuse disruption with victory." Listen to me carefully. The victimized IoT devices have not been magically secured. Yes, the government went in and wiped the malware from memory. They severed the connection to the command and control servers. But did they patch the underlying vulnerability? No, they can't. That is left up to the end user. And as we all know in OT and IT, relying on end users to flash the firmware on a 5-year-old smart TV box or an Asus router is a losing strategy. So what happens now? The reset button was pushed. That's all. The ecosystem still heavily favors the attackers. The operators of Kimwolf, Jackskid, and Mossad are probably sitting in a dark room right now. They're just writing a new script. And with the advent of AI, scaling these attacks has become exponentially easier, and that's why I'm talking about this one today. They don't have to manually hunt for exploits anymore. They can use AI-driven tools to scan the internet, find the exact same 3 million unpatched devices that the government just cleaned, and reinfect them within hours. As one expert in the SC World article pointed out, taking down the communication server just means that the threat actors can't issue new commands to their bots today. But the devices are still sitting there, vulnerable, waiting to be swept up in the next botnet. It's a perpetual game of whack-a-mole. And did the government just take responsibility to continue to monitor those 3 million devices in case that happens? This brings us to the controversial gray hat defensive concept, forced remediation. If we know that 3 million devices are inherently vulnerable and the owners will never patch them, do the ISPs have the responsibility or even the right to quarantine those devices? Or taking it a step further, should gray hat vigilantes step in? We've seen this in the past with vigilante worms like the Jaime and Brickerbot. This is where a hacker compromises vulnerable devices not to launch a DDoS account, but to forcefully patch in the vulnerability or brick the device so it can't be weaponized. Is the vigilante patching ethical? Well, absolutely not by traditional white hat standards. It violates the core tenets of having authorization before you do anything. But in a world where a 30 terabit DDoS attack can take offline critical supply chains, emergency services, or even the Department of Defense's information network, some argue that waiting for the user to comply with these standards is the luxury we just can no longer afford. This is the ultimate gray hat defensive dilemma. The traditional model of defense, patch management, perimeter firewalls, user education, is fundamentally broken at the consumer's IoT edge. And unfortunately, the consumer edge bleeds directly into our enterprise and sometimes our OT networks. With remote work being a perimeter fixture or a permanent fixture, an employee's compromised home router is a direct threat to a corporate VPN it connects to. These bots are living off the land. They're inside the network. They're ready to move laterally. So what is the takeaway for us? For the plant managers, for the CISOs, for the OT network engineers or cybersecurity practitioners, if you are listening to this podcast, first, you have to assume that the edge is hostile. If your employees are remoting into the ICS environment, you must operate under a zero trust architecture. You cannot trust the home network. That Android TV box sitting in your operator's living room might have just been cleared of an ISO malware by the feds, but it'll be infected with something worse tomorrow. Second, we need to focus on a bot eradication within our own perimeters process. It's not just a mitigation, it's eradication. If you are running legacy IoT devices on your OT network, unmanaged switches, old webcams, legacy environmental sensors, all that kind of stuff, you need to isolate them. Segment that network. Because if an AI-driven threat actor manages to turn one of those inside of your perimeter into a botnet or into a bot, the call is coming from the inside of your house. Lastly, we need to keep an eye on the legal and political fallout of this joint operation between the US, Germany, and Canada. The J-Post and Euronews articles made it clear how proud these governments are of this active defense approach. They see it as a success. We are shifting from an era of passive defense to an era where Western governments will actively hack back to protect infrastructure. We just saw that passed a couple of weeks ago. As cybersecurity professionals, we have to navigate this new reality. When does a government's takedown operation become a risk to our own uptime? We need to build systems that are resilient, not just against malicious threat actors, but against the heavy-handed collateral damage induced by the cures deployed by these authorities. We are living in a gray world, folks. The pristine binary ideas of white hats and black hats, those are gone. When law enforcement uses malware to clean networks and botnet operators use AI to outscale the defense, we have to adapt our strategies. We have to be pragmatic. We have to be paranoid, but we have to also be prepared. Now we're switching over to the recently uncovered KadNap malware. So this doesn't seem like as big of a deal compared to the 3 million nodes we talked about earlier, but you'll see why this is important as we go. So if you've been following cybersecurity feeds, BGR, The Independent, CyberPress, Circle ID, they're in my notes. You've likely seen the headlines over the past week, 2 weeks. Over 14,000 edge devices, primarily ASUS routers, compromised worldwide to fuel an unprecedented cyber attack proxy network. So what makes KadNap tick? How did it spread? And more importantly, if you were a gray hat operator, how would you offensively tear this thing apart from the inside? Let's start with the offensive architecture, the blueprint of the attack. To defeat a botnet, you have to appreciate the engineering behind it. And honestly, from a purely technical standpoint, whoever built KadNap knew exactly what they were doing. According to reports from Lumen's Black Lotus Labs, KadNap is a genius-level course in evasion and resilience, very important elements of a successful botnet. The operators didn't just spin up a central command and control server on AWS or some bulletproof hosting provider and then just call it a day. No, central servers are a single point of failure. If law enforcement or a major tech coalition finds a central command and control server, they seize the domain, sinkhole the traffic, and the botnet dies. To prevent this, KadNap utilized a decentralized peer-to-peer system. CyberPress highlighted that KadNap utilized a custom version of the KadNap distributed hash table. A distributed hash table, we're just going to call it a DHT. This is a protocol. For those unfamiliar, the distributed hash table, or DHT, is the same underlying technology that powers decentralized file sharing networks, like BitTorrent, been around for decades. From an offensive gray hat perspective, this is a beautiful application of living off the land techniques, but at the network protocol level. So by using a custom DHT, KadNap hides its command instructions within the background noise of a standard peer-to-peer internet. You look at the network logs of an infected router, and it just looks like user traffic using like some kind of a torrent site. There is no central server to take down. Every infected node acts as a relay, keeping the zombie army just alive. So how do these devices actually get infected? The initial vector preys on the fact that edge devices, these SOHO routers, small office hardware, are the forgotten stepchildren of the IT world. As Circle ID reported, these devices sit at that boundary of the internet, yet they rarely receive automatic firmware updates. KadNap exploits known vulnerabilities in those devices. The infection chain is ruthlessly efficient. First, the targeted device is forced to download a malicious shell script called an AIC.sh. This isn't the heavy machinery, this is the crowbar to pry the window open. The script's main job is simply to persist. It sets up a scheduled task, a cron job if you will, that runs every single hour. Even if the router drops its connection, or if the user notices a glitch and restarts the service, the cron job, that thing's just going to kick back up and ensure that that backdoor stays open. Once persistence is established, the script pulls down the main payload, an ELF executable simply named CAD. Starting to come together, KadNap. Once CAD is running, the router is fully assimilated. But what is the end goal here? Why build a 14,000 node decentralized network? It is a massive distributed denial of service network to take down a nation state's infrastructure. That's why they build it. It's about monetization. The Independent and BGR noted that KadNap's bots are actively being sold through a proxy service called Doppelganger. Doppelganger is believed to be a rebrand of Faceless. This is the notorious proxy service tied to the Moon malware campaign from years ago. I'm not going to go into that. You can look it up. Cyber criminals pay to route their traffic through these 14,000 infected home routers. If you're a hacker in a sanctioned country trying to brute force a corporate network in New York, you don't use your own IP address. You rent a doppelganger node. Suddenly, your malicious login attempts appear to be coming from a suburban ASUS router in Ohio. It bypasses geofencing. It renders traditional IP blacklists almost entirely useless. So now let's pivot. Let's put on our gray hats and talk defense. If we look at a standard white hat corporate advice, you'll hear the same three things. Update your firmware. Reboot your devices frequently because sometimes malware only lives in volatile memory, and secure your management interfaces. Don't expose those router admin panels to the public internet. And yes, that's excellent. That's good advice. If every user did that, KadNap wouldn't have the 14,000 nodes. But we live in a real world. We live in a world where homeowners aren't patching their routers. So what does a gray hat defensive strategy look like against these decentralized DHT botnets? A gray hat doesn't just patch their own router and walk away. A gray hat looks at the KadNap protocol and asks, how can I poison the well? Because KadNap relies on the distributed hash table to share pure lists and routing information, it is theoretically vulnerable to something called a Sybil attack, or DHT routing table poisoning. In a traditional Sybil attack, an active defender or gray hat could spin up thousands of virtual fake KadNap nodes in a controlled lab environment, reverse engineer the CAD binary, figure out the custom cryptographic handshakes that they are using for their specific DHT network, and then introduce fake nodes into the swarm. When the real infected routers reach out to the network to ask, hey, where do I get my next command? Who else is online? The fake nodes intercept those requests. Instead of passing along a real command data from the bot herder, they send garbage data. They send them routing tables filled with dead IP addresses, or better yet, loopback addresses. Efficiently, they blind the botnet. The infected routers are still infected, but they can't talk to each other anymore. The doppelganger proxy service fails because the routing logic collapses. So why is this a gray hat move? Because actively interacting with and intentionally disrupting a criminal infrastructure often falls into a legal gray area. A strict white hat researcher at a cybersecurity firm will observe, report to law enforcement, and publish indicators of compromise or IOCs, which Lumen did brilliantly, by the way. They've begun proactively blocking network traffic associated with doppelganger. But the gray hat mentality is about active defense. That's where our governments are headed. It's the controversial idea of hacking back. Some extreme gray hat concepts have even involved creating vigilante worms. Imagine a piece of malware that uses the exact same exploits as KadNap to break into those 14,000 ASUS routers. But instead of installing a proxy node, the vigilante worm installs a hotfix, patches the vulnerability, disables the remote management interface, and then uninstalls itself. Is it ethical to break into someone else's router to fix it without their permission? Legally, in the US and most of the world, that is a cybercrime, regardless of your good intentions. But philosophically, in the underground forums, it's a debate, and this rages on. It's been going on for years. When critical edge infrastructure is actively being weaponized to attack others, does the security community have a moral imperative to neutralize the weapon by any means necessary? That is a question for you. That is the reality of modern cyber warfare. As you continue to deploy millions of poorly secured IoT and edge devices, threat actors will keep building these resilient decentralized command structures. KadNap is a wake-up call. It shows us that malware authors are borrowing the best concepts from decentralized tech to make their botnets unkillable. Defeating threats like KadNap requires a mix of standard hygiene, please patch your Soho routers, and advanced collaborative network defense. It requires ISPs and backbone providers to look at traffic patterns, even point-to-point traffic, and identifying the anomalies. And somewhere in the shadows, it might just require a few gray hats poisoning a custom DHT routing table to buy the rest of us some time. Okay, now I know what you're thinking. I've told you about what's going on in the botnet space. I even gave you a scenario, but you want to know more about what botnets are. How do you defend against them? So now we're going to break down exactly what botnets are. We're going to take a deep dive into how they work, look at the biggest players in the world right now, like Isaru and Kimwolf, and discuss a terrifying new variable that I'm sure you're all worried about, how AI is changing the game. But most importantly, in this final segment, I'm going to equip you with best practices for detecting, identifying, protecting against, and stopping them in your environments. Let's start with the basics. Botnet is a portmanteau of robot and network. In the cybersecurity world, we often just call them zombie armies. So botnet, bot, zombie, all together. Imagine millions of compromised internet-connected devices. We aren't just talking about enterprise servers. We are talking about IP cameras. The IP cameras that are in your factories are monitoring your ships. The Wi-Fi router in your living room, or the one that you didn't know was installed in your asset, or even an Android TV box. Hackers infect these devices with malware. They strip away your control and hand it over to the central bot herder. We call that a bot master. In the traditional IT world, a botnet might look like or mean a sluggish network or stolen data. But in the OT world, in the operational technology world, a botnet infection can be catastrophic. OT devices like programmable logic controllers, PLCs, remote terminal units, RTUs, and industrial sensors, which could be IIoT sensors, often run on legacy protocols and lack the built-in antivirus software. If a botnet sweeps through an unsegmented industrial network, it can cause immense latency, disrupt critical physical processes, or completely knock operations offline through massive distributed denials of service. So how does this threat actor build an army of 3 million devices like we heard about earlier? It follows a ruthless, highly automated life cycle. Let's talk about that life cycle. Phase 1, this is the infection and the propagation. Botnets constantly scan the internet for vulnerable devices. They look for two main things: unpatched vulnerabilities like outdated firmware on your router, and weak or default credentials. If you deploy an industrial sensor and leave the password as admin, a botnet scanner will find it. It will log into it. It will drop its malware payload. It will do that within minutes. Phase 2, this is the command and control phase. Once infected, the zombie device reaches out for orders from its command and control server. Historically, these were centralized servers, but today's botnets are highly evasive. We just talked about KadNap. Many use decentralized peer-to-peer architectures, meaning the bots talk directly to each other and then they pass along their commands one to the other. This makes it incredibly hard for law enforcement to shut them down because it's not all of them reaching back to the same point. And then phase 3. This is the execution and monetization. You wonder, why do we even need a botnet? Why do people use them? What do the bot herders do with this power? They rent it out via a cybercrime as a service model. They launched DDoS attacks to flood target servers with so much traffic that they crash. They also use these devices for crypto mining. This burns out the hardware, or they can burn out the hardware, or they can just turn the devices into proxy nodes. This can be used to route malicious traffic through your factory's IP addresses. And ultimately, this hides their tracks. This hides the criminals' tracks. So to defend our networks, we need to know who we're fighting. Here is the threat landscape as it stands right now. This is early 2026. It's March 22nd. So Isaru and Kimwolf, like we mentioned earlier, the U.S. Department of Justice alongside Germany and Canada dismantled the infrastructure of 4 massive botnets: Isaru, Kimwolf, Jackskid, and Mossad. Combined, they controlled over 3 million devices. Isaru was a monster. It recently launched a record-shattering 31.4 terabits per second UDP flood attack. And Kimwolf, that's just an Isaru variant, specialized in targeting devices behind firewalls. and then they could propagate through internal networks. That was their specific mission, like your OT networks. That's what they're looking for. The Mirai legacy. You can't talk about IoT botnets without mentioning Mirai. Originally launching massive attacks back in 2016, Mirai's source code was leaked online. Today, the vast majority of new IoT malware still contains modified versions of that code. So that's why we bring them up. Mirai code. It remains a persistent threat because it is incredibly efficient at brute forcing default credentials. Okay. Androx Ghost and GAFGit. These are highly resilient hybrid botnets. GAFGit targets Linux-based systems and cloud environments. Now that's kind of scary. So a lot of people are going to cloud native sources. They perform intensive crypto mining and they maintain distributed denial of service capabilities. So they'll set up this botnet in these Linux-based or cloud-based devices. They can use them to crypto mine, stealing all that capability and running up your bill, but they can also use it to deploy a distributed denial of service. But Androx Ghost, well, they heavily target web servers and IoT devices. They are currently seen as a severe persistent threat to critical infrastructure. So these right here, the Androx Ghost and the GAFGit, are very concerning in the OT space. And here's where things get really concerning. Over the last year, we've seen artificial intelligence move from a theoretical threat to a practical weapon for bot herders. The integration of AI is completely changing how botnets operate. Autonomous AI swarms. We are no longer just dealing with static scripts. In 2025, threat researchers confirmed the rise of large language model coordinated attacks. Instead of a human bot herder manually sending commands, AI models are managing the swarms, analyzing target defenses in real time, and automatically shifting attack vectors, say from UDP flood to an HTTP GET flood. The moment a firewall tries to block them, they just go UDP, HTTP GET. Also, reinforcement learning and evasion. So think about a botnet that can learn and evade. API-based bots are using reinforcement learning. This constantly tests and bypasses bot defenses. They learn what behaviors get them blocked, and they adapt the request rates and also their headers to mimic legitimate human traffic, and they do it perfectly. Also, polymorphic malware. AI is being used to write malicious code that constantly rewrites itself. This means signature-based antivirus solutions are becoming obsolete against modern botnets because the file hash changes every time the malware replicates. Okay, so enough about the doom and gloom. Let's talk about how we fight back. As OT security professionals, how do we detect, identify, protect, and stop these AI-powered armies? Well, first, let's start with detection and identification. Baseline your network. You can't spot an anomaly if you don't know what normal in your network looks like. Use AI-driven monitoring to learn your environment's baseline. If an IP camera suddenly starts sending gigabits of traffic to an unknown server in another country, you have a botnet infection. Watch for command and control beaconing. Look for repeated regular outbound connections from your internal devices to external IP addresses. You probably see this stuff with different devices on your network if you're actively monitoring anyway. You probably expect that to be there at some level, but not this frequently, and not to things that weren't pre-configured based off of your standards. Also look for highly unusual DNS requests. Things going to a DNS name XYZ12579.net or something. That's probably not usual. Next, we need to know how to protect. Kill default passwords. This is non-negotiable. The moment a device is taken out of the box, change the manufacturer's default password to a complex, unique credential before you put it on your network. Strict network segmentation. The Purdue model is your blueprint. I know there's a lot about zones and conduits and other types of segmentation models, but the Purdue model was designed in a way to help defend against cybersecurity attacks for a reason, and it is a very good, effective model. Your IT network must be strictly segmented from your OT network, and internet-facing IoT devices should be isolated on a separate virtual local area network. A compromised smart thermostat in the front office should never be able to route traffic to the PLC controlling your turbines. They should be completely separate. And I said separate VLAN, but also with security in between. Aggressive patching. I know patching in OT is hard. You have strict uptime requirements, but you must have a strategy to update firmware on routers, firewalls, and edge devices. It's not a one size fits all, but those devices are really important to patch. Just because you label them OT doesn't mean that you don't patch them anymore because of other OT devices that you can't patch. Attackers will find those unpatched. They will also look for 0 days in those devices. You have to make sure they're configured correctly, patch them. Finally, how can we stop botnets? If that was protection, then what are we doing to stop them? Rate limit and UDP filtering. Since many botnets rely on UDP floods, implement strict rate limiting on your firewalls for any non-essential UDP ports. Distributed denial of service protection. Utilize high-capacity cloud-based DDoS scrubbing services capable of handling terabit scale attacks. You cannot absorb a 30 TBPS attack on your own local infrastructure. It has to be a scalable environment, high capacity. Rapid incident response. Have a rapid isolation protocol. If a segment of your floor is infected, you need the capability to sever its connection in the wider internet immediately without shutting down the physical mechanical processes. This is where the segmentation was really important from before. Because you baselined your networks, you have a segmentation process or practice in place. Rapid incident response allows you to know exactly where to sever or segment when you need to, but you have to do all those together. Now, before I go, I hope that you learned something from this episode. You learned a little bit more about what botnets are, what's going on in the space of botnet cyber attacks and defenses. And just realize this, botnets are a numbers game. With AI, the attackers are automating their offense at a record pace. That means we have to be relentless with our defense. Don't let your infrastructure become a weapon in someone else's cyber war. Don't let your routers become bots. Don't let your devices become zombies. And with that, thank you for tuning in to CyberSecureOT. Stay vigilant, segment those networks, and stay tuned. I'll catch you on the next episode.